The wind on Ellsworth Moor carries more than just mist. It carries memories that whisper long after the dead are buried. In a house shadowed by war and silence, guilt wears a velvet dress, and truth waits patiently behind a closed drawer. As Porro listens, and the moor holds its breath, justice flickers like a match in the fog. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is. Let me know in the comments. Let's step into the shadows of the past together. It was one of those rare mornings when the world seemed untroubled, a small mercy in a world increasingly cluttered with urgency and telegrams. Porro and I sat at our usual table in the breakfast room, the window thrown slightly open to admit a modest breeze scented faintly with honeysuckle. Outside, the lawn was still with dew, and a finch hopped briskly along the sill, chirping with enviable certainty. Porro, as always, was meticulous with his toast, each triangle buttered to the edge and paired with an exactly measured dab of orange marmalade. I was halfway through my eggs when Mrs. Chilvers, our housekeeper, entered with a brown envelope upon a silver tray. "It bears a military seal, sir," she said, her voice lowered as if the letter itself might overhear. Porro's eyes narrowed. He reached for it with the tips of his fingers, turning it once before opening it. "From an old acquaintance," he murmured. "Colonel Godfrey Lake." He scanned the page quickly, then folded it with curious precision. "A death," he added quietly, "and an invitation." I took the envelope from Porro's hand and unfolded the single sheet. The paper was thick, expensive, military stationery, though its contents were surprisingly sparse. The writing was firm, but oddly restrained. "My dear M. Porro, forgive the abruptness of this note, but I must request your immediate presence at Ellsworth Hall. My cousin, Gerald Harriman, was found dead on the moor 2 nights ago. The death is officially an accident, but I am not at ease with that explanation. There are things not spoken, things that trouble me. Come if you can. G. Lake." "That's all," I said, flipping the page in search of further elaboration. Porro gave a delicate shrug. "It is enough, mon ami. Colonel Lake is a man not given to fancy. If he says there is disquiet, then disquiet there is. But do you really think there's something behind it? A man walks alone at night and falls. Tragic, yes, but hardly sinister." Porro did not answer immediately. He was gazing out the window at the neatly trimmed hedge, as if it too might be concealing something it preferred not to show. "Let us see what he does not say. Hastings," he replied at last. It was nearly an hour before he spoke again of the letter. By then he had set it on the mantelpiece beside the brass clock, where it sat upright like an unwelcome guest. "The moor," he said thoughtfully. "It is not a place of logic. Mist, silence, too much sky, all these things disturb the little grey cells. They do not please Porro. I don't imagine the Yorkshire weather will either," I remarked, glancing at the overcast sky beyond our breakfast window. "And this Ellsworth Hall," he continued, as if I had not spoken. "I know it by name only, an old property, a family of some consequence, though not immense wealth. And this cousin, Gerald Harriman, I wonder, what, precisely?" Porro tapped the letter. "It is the word not spoken that interests me. Not unexplained or curious, but not spoken. That is the language of guilt, Hastings, of silence too carefully preserved." I tilted my head. "So you are considering it?" He straightened a sleeve. "Mais oui. The case is already whispering to me, and when a case whispers, Porro listens, even if it leads to damp shoes and hostile sheep." The train to Yorkshire departed London under a sky that grew steadily more sullen as the landscape shifted from suburban neatness to bleak and sprawling fields. Porro sat composed and rather wrapped in himself, his valise by his side, and a slim book of French verse, unopened in his lap. I, by contrast, had taken a window seat and watched the hedgerows blur by in streaks of grey and green. "We are being called into an atmosphere of unease," Porro murmured suddenly, startling me from my view. "You mean Colonel Lake's letter?" "I mean the tone of it, mon ami. It has the flavour of an old wound reopened, something personal. A military man does not write in such terms lightly." "I dare say he was fond of his cousin," I offered. Porro shook his head. "Affection alone does not summon Hercule Poirot. No, there is something beneath it, something not written." We lapsed again into silence, but it was a silence full of unasked questions. The train slowed as we passed into the northern moorlands, and the sky hung lower now, as though pressing itself against the earth. It was a landscape of memory and ghosts. Our carriage met us at the station, an old trap with narrow wheels, and a driver whose weathered face had the colour of old leather. The road curved upward almost immediately, winding into country that felt untouched by any century since the last war. The moor unfolded on either side like an unspeaking witness, vast and untamed, with tufts of heather rising from the mist, like bruises on the skin of the land. I confess, the sight unsettled me. There was something too open about it, too willing to let a man disappear. Porro, for his part, made a small sound of distaste as we bounced over a rut in the road. "The countryside is always exaggerated in England," he said. "Too much nature. It is disorder in its purest form." "You must admit it has a kind of beauty," I said, though even I found myself glancing at the shifting shadows beyond the stone fences. "Perhaps," he allowed. "But it is a beauty that swallows, not one that reveals." And then, quite suddenly, we saw it. Ellsworth Hall rose from the edge of the moor like something etched in slate, 3 stories of severe stone, with narrow windows and a roofline that seemed to retreat rather than greet. Ivy clung to one side like old gilt, and the long gravel drive leading to the entrance was flecked with fallen leaves, though it was not yet autumn. As we drew near, a single curtain stirred in one of the upper windows, a glimpse perhaps of someone waiting or watching. I could not say why, but I shivered. Porro merely said, "Bon, let us meet the ghosts." We were received at the entrance hall not by a butler, but by Colonel Godfrey Lake himself, a tall weathered man in his late 50s, dressed plainly and bearing the look of a man who had spent his life in service of the Crown, and found retirement no less fatiguing. "Porro, Hastings," he said, his voice low but firm, "you've come quickly. I am grateful." The handshake was brisk and dry, like the man himself, yet behind his clipped speech lay a stiffness that had little to do with discipline. His gaze, though steady, flicked now and then toward the great staircase, and he seemed ever so slightly short of breath. "Welcome to Ellsworth Hall," he added, with the distinct air of one who would rather not have to say so. The hall itself was dim and draughty, a long corridor stretching east to west with heavy portraits in ancestral gloom. A grandfather clock ticked audibly, each second more hollow than the last. "There's been a death," he continued, "but that is not the end of it in Porro, only the beginning, I fear." Porro inclined his head. "The dead do not speak, Colonel, but sometimes the living reveal too much, or too little." We were shown into the Colonel's study, a room of dark leather and the faint scent of pipe tobacco, with a single decanter on a silver tray, conspicuously untouched. Colonel Lake gestured to the armchairs and took his own seat stiffly, as though it resisted him. "It was 2 nights ago," he began, his voice more formal now, almost mechanical. "My cousin Gerald went out for his evening walk. He often did so, particularly when the rest of the house had retired." "And where did he go?" Porro asked. folding his hands with studied precision. "The north edge of the property. There's a rise, a crag, rather, called Ashkum Point. The view is excellent by moonlight." Porro's eyes narrowed. But he did not return. No, his body was found at the foot of the slope. His neck was broken. "A fall?" The colonel nodded, but not with conviction. "That is the verdict. Slipped in the dark, they say." But Gerald was not careless in Porro. He knew that land like the back of his hand. "And yet," Porro murmured, "the moor is patient, it waits for those who wander too far." Lake gave a dry laugh. "You sound like the villagers. They say they heard footsteps after." The morning passed in a haze of quiet interviews and careful observations. Porro, as ever, conducted his inquiries with gentle irreverence, always courteous, always precise, yet never failing to unsettle even the most composed of subjects. Gerald Harriman, as it emerged from the household's accounts, had been a man of inward temperament, intelligent, brooding, and fond of isolation. He had served with distinction during the war, but had returned with a silence about him that never quite left. "He walked every night," said Miss Dora Vale, a slight, nervous woman who painted watercolors and took her tea. "Always alone, always in the same direction." "Was he melancholy?" Porro asked gently. "No more than the rest of us," she replied, a little too quickly. Mr. Allen Hesketh, a soft-spoken gentleman claiming to be a poet, added, "He wasn't cruel, but he never quite joined the living again after the war." Even the servants spoke of Gerald in hushed tones, as though he were a ghost long before he died. "He liked the quiet," said the housekeeper. "He said the wind on the moor spoke to him, said it remembered things that men had forgotten." Porro looked up. "Indeed, but the moor forgets nothing." When Porro inquired after Lady Margaret Harriman, the late Gerald's widow, Colonel Lake's features hardened almost imperceptibly. "She remains in her wing of the house," he said. "Has not left it since the body was brought back." "She grieves deeply," I ventured. "She grieves differently," he replied. "Margaret is not a demonstrative woman, but she and Gerald, it was not an easy marriage." Porro arched a brow. "And she will not see us?" "She has refused to see anyone. Not even me." "Ah," said Porro with a little sigh. "When a door is closed too firmly, it is often because something fragile stands behind it." "She keeps to the Red Room," the colonel added. "Always did. It was her sister's once. Before the war, that last sentence seemed to hang in the air like a forgotten bell note." Porro said nothing more, but I saw the glimmer in his eye. That evening, the drawing-room was subdued, its lamps dimmed to amber, and the conversation drifting in and out of polite irrelevance. Porro sat quietly beside the fireplace, sipping his tisane and observing with the faintest of smiles. I noticed him watching the cousins, Mr. Charles Harriman, a man of finance with an impatient brow, and his sister Edith, a widow with too many pearls and too few convictions. They sat on opposite ends of the same settee, not speaking. "Is it true," Edith said at last, turning to her brother with a hint of acid, "that Gerald had not yet signed the new will?" Charles narrowed his eyes. "Is it relevant?" "Perhaps not," she said airily. "Though I imagine it's awfully inconvenient. For some." Porro rose, as if to adjust a cushion, but I knew better. He stood just long enough to note the tension in their shoulders, the unspoken accusation that passed between them like a draught. "I find," he said softly, "that a man's death reveals more about the living than the dead." No one replied. Outside, the wind stirred faintly against the windows. Later that night, I ventured upstairs with the intention of retrieving a book from my valise. The corridor was dim, the sconces turned low. As I reached the first landing, I happened to glance up, and there, in the shadows above, I saw her. A woman stood at the far end of the upper hallway, her figure still as stone. She was dressed in black, her face half turned, pale beneath a netted veil. Her eyes, though I could not clearly see them, seemed to rest on me with quiet calculation. "Lady Margaret?" I asked, unsure why I whispered. But she did not answer. She remained motionless for a moment longer, and then, quite silently, stepped backward into the shadows and disappeared into the Red Wing. I stood for a long moment, uncertain whether I had truly seen her. Behind me, the clock on the landing struck 9, and somewhere, faintly, the floorboards creaked, as if echoing someone else's steps long after they'd gone. The east wing of Ellsworth Hall was strangely still, a silence that did not merely result from absence, but seemed actively preserved. The maid who guided us, a pale girl named Elsie with nerve hands, walked ahead with deliberate care, her footsteps barely registering on the threadbare runner that lined the corridor. "No one comes here, sir," she whispered, as if the very walls might resent the intrusion. "Not since before it happened." Porro made no reply. His gaze traced the pattern of the wallpaper, faded red thistles against cream, and lingered briefly on the closed doors, each identical but for the brass handles, polished to varying degrees. "She does not eat with the household?" he asked at last. The maid shook her head. "No, monsieur, her meals are brought to her. She doesn't speak much, and she only leaves the Red Room after dark." "Curious," murmured Porro, "and yet, not surprising." We stopped before a door at the far end. The brass plate had once borne a name, now removed, leaving 2 neat holes and a pale square in the varnish. Elsie knocked lightly, then waited. No voice answered. "She's not one for visitors," the maid said softly. "Even before the death." We waited in silence. The corridor was oddly warm, as though the air had been long trapped and grown stale. From behind the door came no sound, no movement of paper, no rustle of skirts. Just stillness. After a minute, the maid knocked again, this time a little more firmly. Still no answer. She leaned close and murmured, "Lady Margaret, Monsieur Poirot has come." Colonel Lake said. Her voice faded. Then from within the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, approaching the door. A latch clicked, but the door remained shut. "She is indisposed," came a low voice. Female, but not Lady Margaret's. Likely a lady's maid. "She sends her regrets." Porro stepped forward. "Would she accept a note, madame? Something brief and private?" There was a pause. "Then, you may send it." The latch clicked again. The footsteps withdrew, and silence returned. Porro turned to me with a faint smile. "Even locked doors, Hastings," he said, "can be made to speak, if one listens patiently enough." We descended the corridor slowly. Porro was pensive, fingers to his chin, until he suddenly turned to Elsie, who had remained at a respectful distance. "You have served Lady Margaret long, mademoiselle." She hesitated. 2 years, monsieur, since before the war ended, and in all that time was she ever different? Elsie glanced down at her hands. She was always quiet, but not cold, not before. She laughed once, I remember, when Miss Edith spilled ink on her gloves. That was 2 winters ago. She hasn't laughed since. "And at night?" Porro asked. "She walks?" A brief nod. "Only inside the room. You can hear it through the floor, back and forth. Sometimes for hours, never with shoes on, just the soft steps. And sometimes I think she's speaking, but not loud enough to make out." Porro tilted his head. "And what of her writing desk?" Elsie's eyes widened a fraction. "It's always locked. She keeps a letter there, folded in a book. I've seen it when she thought no one was looking. She reads it over and over, but she never opens the envelope." "Ah," said Porro gently. "A letter unread, that is a thing of great weight." Later that afternoon, seeking some air and respite from the cloistered tension of the house, I wandered out to the gardens. The wind was brisk, tugging at the leaves with a low whistling discontent. Above, the sky brooded, and the moor stretched beyond the hedge, vast and unresolved. I happened to glance up at the east wing, the windows of the Red Room, tall and narrow like sentinels, and there she was. Lady Margaret stood behind the glass, her posture rigid, her face pale and oddly luminous in the gloom. Her expression was unreadable, not grief, exactly, nor hostility. Rather a quiet scrutiny, as if I were a piece in some puzzle she no longer wished to solve. We held that silent gaze for several seconds. I raised a hand in polite acknowledgement. She did not move. Only the curtain swayed gently at her side, like breath held too long. Then, with a flick of motion, she turned from the window and disappeared into shadow. The invitation arrived shortly after supper, a brief, unsigned note delivered by Elsie, requesting Porro's presence in the Red Room at 9. He asked me to accompany him, and together we ascended the east wing, the corridor no less oppressive by candlelight. Lady Margaret received us standing. She was dressed in deep burgundy, her figure slight but straight, and her hair swept back in a style that revealed the stark architecture of her face. She did not offer her hand, nor did she greet us. Instead, she inclined her head once and gestured to two low chairs set before the fireplace. "I have agreed to this meeting," she said, her voice cool and unhurried, "because I believe it may expedite your departure." "Madame," Poirot said, taking his seat, "forgive me if I linger, but the dead, they leave puzzles, and I am rather fond of puzzles." Her lips curved ever so slightly, though whether it was amusement or derision, I could not say. "I dare say Gerald left many," she said, "but if you seek sentiment, you won't find it here. You did not love him." "I loved what he was," she replied, "before the war, before he returned a stranger." "And now?" Poirot asked softly. "Now," she said, folding her hands, "I mourn the man who never came home." There was no tremor in her voice, no flicker of emotion, but behind her, on the writing desk, sat a glass dome encasing a single withered rose, long dead, long preserved. A symbol perhaps of love remembered too long. Porro noticed it. I know he did, but he said nothing. He simply nodded, as one does at a grave. As the conversation turned to quieter waters, Poirot leaned forward slightly. "There is, I understand, a letter," he said gently. "One you have read, but not opened." Lady Margaret's gaze did not shift. "Elsie speaks too freely. Only when she is concerned," Porro said. "You have kept it many years, I imagine." She stood and crossed to the writing desk. Her movements were not hurried, but neither were they hesitant. Unlocking a small drawer, she withdrew a single envelope, its edges softened by time. "It is from Gerald," she said, "sent during the war. It was never delivered. I found it among his effects after his death. And you have not opened it." "I have not," she said. "What good could it do? He is dead, and the past cannot be repaired." Poirot's eyes rested on the envelope. "Sometimes, madame," he said softly, "the past contains not pain but release." Lady Margaret's fingers curled tightly around the letter. "It is of no importance," she said, returning it to the drawer. "To anyone but me." The drawer clicked shut, the key turned, and I saw for the first time her hand tremble. Our visit to the shepherd's cottage was made late morning, the moor's usual chill tempered only by a weak sun struggling through a canopy of low-hanging clouds. Joel Blakely was a gaunt man, his skin weathered to the color of sun-baked earth, and his eyes a clear, piercing blue that spoke of long nights spent alone with the wind. He met us on the doorstep, leaning on a well-worn staff, his expression cautious but not unfriendly. "I hear you want to know about the night Gerald Harriman died," he said, voice rough but steady. Poirot inclined his head slightly. "Indeed, Monsieur Blakely, the moor holds many secrets, but some are more urgent than others." Joel led us inside, where the air was thick with the scent of peat smoke and wool. His hands, calloused from years of tending sheep, folded across his chest as he began his tale, his gaze fixed on a small window that overlooked the wild moor beyond. "It was late," Joel said, "near midnight, I reckon. The moon was a pale ghost, just enough light to see the heather's edges. I was tending the flock when I heard it, a sharp cry, not like a sheep, no, more human, a woman's voice perhaps, a cry for help, desperate and brief." He paused, the memory evidently vivid. After the cry, silence fell. Then footsteps. They came close, quick and sure, moving away from where I stood. But then they stopped, like someone vanished into thin air. Poirot's eyes gleamed with that familiar spark of intrigue. "And you did not see who it was?" "No, Monsieur Poirot. I could see nothing but shadows. The wind carried the sound, but the shape, the face, it stayed hidden." "What puzzled me most," Joel continued, "was the morning after. I went to check the moor, thinking I might find tracks. But there was nothing, not a single footprint in the dew-damp grass, no sign of anyone walking there, except those belonging to the sheep." Poirot's fingers tapped the wooden table thoughtfully. "Not even the deceased's?" Joel shook his head emphatically. "None. And that's no small thing. You see, the moor keeps a record if you know where to look. But that morning, it was clean as the day it was made." Hastings exchanged a glance with Porro. "Strange indeed, more than strange," Porro said quietly. "It suggests the footsteps were not of the man who died. Someone else was there, and their passing was made deliberately untraceable." Poirot leaned forward, hands steepled. "Monsieur Blakely, at what time precisely did you hear the footsteps?" Joel frowned, considering. "Hard to say exactly, but it was shortly after the cry, maybe 15 minutes, 20 at most." "And in what direction did they travel?" "Toward the south, away from Ashkum Point. Along the path that leads back to the house, I suppose." "Was the wind strong then?" "Yes, enough to carry sound, but not so strong to drown it. It shifted too from east to west." Porro nodded slowly, eyes gleaming. "Intriguing. If someone returned to the moor after the body was found, it might explain the absence of footprints at dawn. They could have come in darkness, under cover of the shifting wind." Joel Blakely's eyes met Porro's. "You think the moor hides more than just a fall?" "I do, monsieur, much more." Later that day, during a sparse luncheon in the great dining room, Porro casually recounted the shepherd's testimony. The room was quiet, the clinking of cutlery the only interruption. As Porro spoke of the cry and the footsteps that vanished, my eyes flicked around the table. One guest, a sharply dressed gentleman with a fine moustache and an expression that masked unease poorly, shifted in his chair. I caught the flicker of something, a quick tightening of the jaw, a slight narrowing of the eyes. Whether it was guilt, fear, or simple discomfort, I could not say. But Porro's gaze did not miss it. After a moment, he resumed, his voice calm but firm. "The moor has its secrets, and tonight we shall endeavor to uncover them." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the low hills and the moor grew a shade darker under a gathering mist, Porro and I took to the empty expanse. The wind whispered through the heather, carrying a chill that seemed to creep beneath the skin. Porro spoke, his voice a soft murmur against the vast silence. "Sound is a curious thing, Hastings. It travels, it deceives, and it can be made to speak lies. I listened, intrigued, but slightly bewildered. When footsteps vanish, he continued, it is either because they were never there, or because someone wished them erased. Time, too, is fluid here. The night folds upon itself, and the truth hides in the spaces between moments. I nodded slowly, though I must confess his abstractions left me somewhat in the dark. But it is why I trust my little grey cells to pierce the fog. The moor's memory is long, and I shall see what it has to tell us. It was late morning when I took to the moor alone. The sky had turned a greyish-white, not overcast but bleached, as though the colour had been leached from the heavens. The air held a faint dampness, and a mist, thin but persistent, hovered just above the heather, shifting like breath upon cold glass. I cannot say what compelled me to walk without purpose. Perhaps it was the strange quiet of the house, or the manner in which Poirot had spent the morning buried in thought, or perhaps the moor itself drew me, that vast expanse of silence into which so much had already vanished. There was something about its stillness that unsettled me, not fear, exactly, more a growing sense of having stepped into someone else's memory, a place where something had once happened and still lingered, even if the air refused to tell. Midway through my walk, I paused. The land around me was low and open, and the wind had dropped. Even the sheep in the distance seemed to have stilled, as if listening. And then it came, that inexplicable sensation, subtle but persistent, the feeling that someone followed, not behind me, not precisely, but near, always just beyond the shoulder, just out of sight. I turned more than once, scanning the moor for any sign of movement. There was none, and yet I felt no peace, only that gnawing presence, as though some remnant of the dead still walked, or worse, that the living had left something of themselves behind. I quickened my pace, not from fear, of course, but I would not be sorry to see the stones of Ashkum Point rise into view. The moor, for all its openness, was beginning to press against my nerves. Ashkum Point was a jagged rise of earth, craggy and uneven, overlooking a gentle descent into a shallow hollow. It was here that Gerald Harriman's body had been discovered, neck broken, limbs sprawled unnaturally, as though cast aside by the moor itself. I approached the spot cautiously. A few scattered stones lay about, slick with moss, and the heather grew dense in patches, interrupted only by small paths worn by sheep and wind. There was nothing extraordinary to see, no signs of struggle, no unusual markings, nothing, in fact, that suggested a death at all. And yet, the place felt wrong, not sinister, but hushed, as if it knew something it refused to reveal. I knelt, brushing my fingers over the earth. It was firm beneath the surface, no softness, no slide. A man would not easily fall here unless he meant to, or unless he was pushed. When I returned to Ellsworth Hall, damp and somewhat chilly, I found Poirot at the small writing table in his guest room, examining something with great concentration. He glanced up as I entered, and gestured for me to come closer. "Regarde, Hastings," he said softly. This is curious." He held out a cracked wristwatch, the leather strap stiff with wear, its glass fractured neatly across the face. The hands were stopped at exactly 17 minutes past 9. "It was recovered from the deceased's wrist," he continued. "Colonel Lake had it brought to me this morning. I took it, turning it slowly in my palm, broken in the fall. But that is not what troubles me." Poirot rose, pacing a short line across the room. "Tell me, mon ami, what time did we hear the villagers believe the body was discovered?" I thought. "Just before midnight, wasn't it?" "Precisely. And yet, this watch, a delicate thing, easily broken by a sudden jolt, stopped more than 2 hours before the body was found." I frowned. You think? I think, Hastings, that either time has lied, or someone has told it to. Porro resumed his seat. His fingers steepled and eyes narrowed. There are only so many explanations, he said. Either the watch stopped before the fall, which is unlikely unless it was already damaged, or the fall occurred much earlier than assumed, and the timeline has been falsely constructed. Falsely? You mean someone staged the scene? Not necessarily staged, mon ami, but perhaps delayed. What if the death occurred at 9:15, and the body was left to be found much later, when the household was asleep, and the witnesses conveniently absent? But why delay it? Porro looked at me with the faintest trace of amusement. That is precisely the question. To delay discovery is to control narrative, to mask opportunity, alibi, or motive. He turned the watch over once more. If Gerald Harriman died at 9:17, then those who claimed to see him later, or hear him, were either mistaken, or lying, or protecting someone, I added. He smiled faintly. Yes, Hastings, that too. Outside, the moor pressed against the windows, silent and eternal. But in Porro's mind, I could see the facts were beginning to move, slowly, but with intent. That evening, I stood once more at the great window of the hallway, looking out across the moor as dusk fell like a slow exhale across the land. The heather moved gently in the wind, though I could not feel it through the glass. I did not know why I had come to stand there, only that the moor seemed to call, not audibly, but with something older than sound, a sense, a memory, not mine, but one I carried, all the same. Porro joined me silently, his hands behind his back. I don't like it, I said. The place, it feels haunted. By the past perhaps, he said. By something unresolved, but not by spirits, Hastings. It is we who carry the echoes, not the land. I nodded, though the heaviness in my chest remained, and somewhere, far off, a sheep bleated, a small startled sound, as if it too had remembered something it could not quite explain. The following morning brought a thin sun through clouded panes and a brittle chill that had settled into the flagstones. The conservatory, with its latticed windows and faded wicker chairs, offered some reprieve. Tea was being served on a delicate cart wheeled in by the housemaid, and the guests gathered with the hushed civility of people who had run out of comfortable things to say. Miss Dora Vale sat slightly apart from the others, her small frame half turned to the light, a sketchpad resting delicately on her lap. She was shading something in charcoal, her strokes tentative, interrupted now and then by the trembling of her hand. Her features, always a touch too fragile for true beauty, were set in quiet concentration, though I thought I saw her eyes dart up more than once, not at Porro or myself, but at the far window where the moor lay beyond in its constant brooding stillness. Porro noticed her too. He said nothing, but his gaze lingered, in an effort to draw her into conversation, for her isolation had begun to seem more than merely artistic. I approached her chair with a smile, and a few innocuous remarks about the light. "You sketch the moor beautifully," I said, glancing at the pad. "You must know it well." She looked up, startled, as though she had not expected anyone to notice. "I walk there when the weather allows," she replied. "It's the only place I can think clearly. The wind seems to carry away all the noise." "May we see more?" I asked gently. Her hesitation was brief. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible nod, she turned the page and revealed a series of landscapes, heathered slopes, stone walls half consumed by moss, and the jagged rise of Ashkum Point, drawn with surprising accuracy. Porro, who had drawn closer without a word, accepted the sketchbook as she offered it, holding it as delicately, as if it were a relic. "I find," he murmured, "that art sometimes sees what the eye does not admit." Porro turned each page slowly, his expression unreadable. There was something in the manner with which he regarded the sketches, not admiration precisely, but scrutiny of a more analytical kind. I, too, leaned in, surprised by the precision of her work. Her eye for the contours of the moor was uncanny, and more than a little haunting. Then he paused. One page had caught his attention. The drawing depicted a ridge not far from the crag where Gerald Harriman had fallen. At first glance, it was like the others, detailed, evocative, and almost desolate in tone. But near the center, tucked behind an outcrop of stone, was a human figure. It was small, sketched in shadow, with no features discernible, merely a silhouette. But it was undeniably there, the posture hunched, the presence ambiguous and concealed. Porro said nothing at first. His eyes flicked once to Miss Vale, then back to the page. "Mademoiselle," he said softly, "when was this drawn?" She bit her lip. "3 weeks ago, I think. Perhaps 4. Before it happened." He held the sketch up in the light. "And the figure?" "I don't know," she said quickly. "It's just a suggestion, a mood." Porro's eyes did not move from hers. "Or a memory." Miss Vale's hands trembled as she reached for her cup. It rattled slightly in its saucer, and she set it down again at once. "I don't remember putting anyone in that drawing," she said, her voice brittle. "It wasn't intentional. Sometimes the lines, they appear. I don't always know why." Porro handed the book back gently, but the weight of his gaze had not lessened. "You are a sensitive soul, mademoiselle," he said quietly. "You observe more than you admit, even to yourself." She looked away. "It's imagination, that's all. The moor plays tricks on the mind." "Why?" Porro agreed softly. "But even a trick leaves footprints." There was a silence. Then she rose abruptly, gathering her pad and charcoal with unnecessary care. "I think I need some air." She walked quickly to the glass doors and vanished into the garden without another word. Porro watched her go. "She is afraid," he said at last. "But not of what she saw. She fears what she knows but cannot bear to name." "You think she saw someone?" I asked. "I think," he said, "she saw something she was not meant to. And now she must convince herself she did not." Porro waited until later that afternoon to approach Miss Vale again. She had returned from her walk, her cheeks flushed and hair slightly disheveled, and was seated on the stone bench near the rose trellis, sketchpad closed beside her. He did not press her. Instead he joined her in silence, speaking only after several minutes had passed. "Tell me, mademoiselle," he said gently, "have you ever walked beyond Ashkum Point?" She hesitated. "Once I lost the path. The fog came down quicker than I expected." "And you found yourself where?" She looked up slowly, as if the answer had weight. "Near the hollow, where Mr. Harriman was found. I didn't know it at the time. I only realized after." "And did you see someone then?" She shook her head. "I don't know. I thought I did. A figure on the rise. Not close enough to see clearly." "Male? Female?" "I couldn't say." "Did they see you?" She hesitated longer this time. Then with quiet dread, "Yes, I think they did. They turned, and then they were gone." Porro nodded slowly. "And you have not spoken of this?" "No. I told myself it was nothing. I still do." But her voice betrayed her. That evening, back in the drawing room, Porro asked quietly to see her sketchbook once more. "I do not wish to alarm you, mademoiselle," he said, "but something in your work may help me understand the final hours of Monsieur Harriman's life." Dora Vale hesitated, then handed it over, her fingers brushing Porro's with surprising warmth. He flipped through it again, slowly, and then paused. "There is a missing page," he said. She looked away. "You tore it out." "Yes." "May I ask why?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, "Because it made me feel ill. I drew it the day before the death. After the walk." "What did it show?" She didn't answer immediately. "A face," she said at last, "but not quite right. Something about the eyes. The angle. I didn't mean to draw it like that, but it felt wrong. I don't know how else to say it." "You still have it?" "No, I burned it." Porro gave a single nod, not of approval, but of understanding. "There is more truth," he said quietly, "in what we destroy than in what we keep." And with that, he handed the sketchbook back, a little lighter now, but no less burdened by silence. The dining room at Ellsworth Hall had never struck me as a place for merriment, but that particular evening it was quieter than usual. Each word spoken seemed to fall flat, swallowed by the heavy drapery and the solemn hush that clung to the air. Porro, seated at my left, busied himself with his consommé in silence, but his gaze was not idle. I noticed it drift again and again to the young footman, Michael, who had replaced the main course with such clumsy haste that he nearly upended the silverware onto Lady Edith's lap. The poor fellow's hands trembled. His face, though pale, glistened faintly with perspiration. When he poured the sherry, the decanter shook against the glass, and I saw Porro's brow lift ever so slightly. "Observe, Hastings," he murmured, when the boy had left the room. "The hands betray the heart. And the heart? It is troubled. Indeed, I could not deny it." Something had unsettled the footman, and I suspected it was more than nerves over dinner service. Later that night, I stepped into the main corridor, intending to fetch a book from my luggage before retiring. The hall was dim, lit only by a single oil lamp near the staircase. As I passed the side parlor, a voice, low and urgent, stopped me. "Mr. Hastings, sir, forgive me." It was Michael. He had appeared from the shadows, hatless, eyes darting toward the drawing-room as though fearful of being seen. "I don't mean to intrude," he said quickly, "but I was wondering if I might speak to Mr. Poirot in private." I frowned. "About what, exactly?" He swallowed. "About Mr. Harriman's death." That gave me pause. His face, now that I looked at it closely, was etched with fear, not of punishment, I thought, but of conscience. "I'll fetch him," I said quietly. "Wait in the study, no one will disturb you there." He nodded and slipped away, as silent as he'd appeared, vanishing into the dark, like a man who had carried his guilt too far and too long. When I returned with Porro, Michael was standing by the fireplace in the small study, twisting his cap between nervous fingers. He looked up at us as we entered, his eyes shadowed by exhaustion, the kind that settles when sleep is no longer an option. "Sit, mon garçon," Porro said gently. "Speak freely. There is no judgment here, only truth." Michael sat, though his posture remained tense. He drew a shaky breath. "It was me, sir. I did it." Porro tilted his head slightly. "You did what?" "I pushed Mr. Harriman on the crag. He'd sacked me that evening, you see. Said I'd been careless with the decanter, called me useless in front of Mr. Hesketh." Michael's hands clenched in his lap. "I lost my temper. I followed him out to the moor, called to him. He turned. I shoved him. He didn't even cry out. Just fell." The room seemed to grow colder. Porro was still. Then he said, "And after?" Michael looked away. "I ran back, sat by the kitchen fire, said nothing. No one saw me." Porro was silent a moment. Then he said softly, "The heart speaks, but often it lies to protect another." Porro steepled his fingers and regarded the young man for a long time. There was no harshness in his eyes, only quiet curiosity. "You say Monsieur Harriman dismissed you that evening?" he asked. Michael nodded. "Yes, sir. Around 8:30, just before he went out. Yet Colonel Lake mentioned no such dismissal when we arrived. You have told no one." "I didn't dare. And he dismissed you for a single mistake." Michael shifted. "It wasn't the first. I suppose I'd been off lately." Porro leaned back, his gaze sharpened. "And you followed him, on foot, in the dark?" "Yes, sir, but there was no moon that night, mon ami. The sky was thick with mist." "How did you see him?" Michael opened his mouth, but no answer came. "Do you wear boots, Michael?" "Yes, sir." "Thick-soled?" I suppose so." Porro nodded. "And yet the moor shows no sign of your prints. Not yours, not his. Strange, n'est-ce pas?" Michael stared at him, stricken. "But you did not kill him," Porro said gently. "But you carry something nonetheless." Michael bowed his head. "I can't say." "Ah," said Porro softly. "Then perhaps it was never your story to tell." Michael's confession, once uttered, seemed to drain him of all strength. He sat hunched in the armchair like a boy expecting punishment. Porro, however, remained still, his eyes sharp with thought. "You claim the incident occurred after 8:30, he said. "And yet Mrs. Braddock, the cook, mentioned you were asleep by 9. She brought you a cup of broth. You remember?" Michael nodded slowly. "Yes. I was tired enough to fall asleep moments after committing a murder." Michael flinched. Porro continued, "And let us consider the time of death. The watch upon Monsieur Harriman's wrist was shattered, but not by accident. It stopped at 9:17. You were in the kitchen then, yes?" Michael said nothing. "You cannot place yourself at two locations, mon garçon," Porro said gently. "Either you pushed him before 9, and someone else killed him later, or you did not push him at all." Michael looked up. "I didn't mean to lie." Porro's voice softened. "You are protecting someone." Michael's eyes brimmed with something unspoken. Not guilt, but loyalty, perhaps. A burden taken on willingly. Porro said nothing more. The silence was full of unasked questions and unspoken names. When Michael had gone, Porro remained seated, his gaze fixed on the empty hearth, as though something vital lay just beyond the flicker of embers long gone cold. I poured him a small glass of brandy, which he accepted with a nod. "You don't believe him," I said. "Non," he replied. His words, "They are shaped with pain." Yes, but not the pain of guilt. The pain of fear, perhaps, or duty. "You think he's shielding someone?" Porro sipped his brandy slowly. "Almost certainly. But more than that, Hastings, the evidence contradicts him. The timepiece, the condition of the body, the lack of footprints, all of it says, no, he's not the killer. No, but he knows who is." Porro rose and moved to the window. Outside, the moor was wrapped in darkness, and the trees swayed as though disturbed by secrets too old to be spoken aloud. "There is a pattern," he said softly, "a rhythm to every lie." His was too neat, too rehearsed. "And the watch?" Porro turned, his face grave. "It was broken at 9:17. That is our truth, and it clears Michael, but not the one who asked him to lie." The next morning, under a cold and uncertain sky, Porro requested we take the motor down to the village, not for supplies, as I had supposed, but to call, unannounced, at the postmaster's cottage. "Why the sudden interest in stamps?" I asked, more amused than curious. Porro only adjusted his gloves and said, "The dead man wrote something once, a letter, and letters, my friend, do not always arrive when they are meant to. The postmaster, A stooped man with rheumy eyes and an accent thicker than the morning frost seemed taken aback by the visit, but ushered us inside. "Old records," he said, scratching at his temple. "I keep 'em, yes, back near the boiler. Never throw anything out, just in case the Crown wakes up and decides to audit us." "May I look for a name?" Porro asked politely. "From 1917. Gerald Harriman," the man chuckled. "Porro years. Lot of things got delayed back then, but if he posted it here, we may find the entry." He fetched a battered ledger from a shelf and laid it out before us, the pages yellowed and curling at the edges. Porro bent over it, the tip of one finger guiding his eyes with the care of a priest at prayer. The postmaster hovered nearby, rubbing his hands for warmth, as Porro scanned the pages with quiet intensity. My own eyes, less trained for such minutiae, roamed the handwritten entries, mostly names I did not know, a blur of local families and unfamiliar regiments. "There," Porro said softly. He tapped the ledger at a line dated March 18, 1917. "Harriman, letter to Lady Margaret Harriman, Ellsworth Hall, withheld, no return address, not delivered, not delivered," I repeated. "But why?" The postmaster leaned in. "Could be anything. Mud on the envelope. Illegible script, lost in the old cart bag. That year the mail was a shambles. If it got separated, it'd have gone to the dead letter shelf." Porro's eyes glinted. "But it was never returned." The man shook his head. "Not that I've got recorded here. If it weren't returned, then it likely stayed buried under some paperwork, or it was picked up by someone other than the post office." He looked at us both, confused. "Funny you'd come asking after a letter that's near 30 years dead." Porro smiled faintly. "Because, monsieur, I believe it is not quite as dead as we think." We returned to Ellsworth Hall, under a lowering sky. The moor loomed on either side, sullen and watchful. Colonel Lake received us in his study, with his usual austerity, though his expression softened when Porro made his request. "Do you recall," Porro asked gently, "a time in 1917, when Lady Margaret was expecting a letter from Gerald, one that never arrived?" Lake leaned back, eyes narrowed with memory. "There was something," he said slowly. "She was restless that spring, quieter than usual. I thought it was grief. Her sister had just died, you see. Margaret blamed Gerald, said he failed her somehow. But there was a week, yes, when she went to the postbox daily, waited for something that never came. And after that," he frowned, "she stopped asking, but something hardened in her, as though whatever she'd hoped for had been lost." Poirot gave a slow nod. "Not lost, Colonel, only delayed." That afternoon, Poirot requested a second audience with Lady Margaret. She received him alone in the Red Room, seated by the fire, her gaze distant as though preoccupied with a time long past. "I imagine," she said dryly, "you've come to ask more questions. I'm afraid I haven't changed my mind about the letter." "Just one question," he said quietly, taking the chair opposite her. "When did you find it?" She stiffened slightly, the slightest tremor in her hands as they rested on her lap. "I beg your pardon, the letter from Gerald. You told your maid it was never opened, and that is true, but it was found recently, not received in 1917. She was silent. "It was hidden among his things," Poirot continued, "perhaps inside a book. A soldier's final message, misplaced by time." Lady Margaret's breath caught, just once. "I found it after the funeral," she said, her voice brittle, "in the drawer of his writing desk. It had fallen behind the lining. I don't know when or how. The envelope was yellowed, but it was addressed to me, and in his hand." Poirot nodded solemnly. "And yet you did not read it?" "No," she whispered. I couldn't. She rose without further word and crossed to the bureau beneath the window. Her movements were deliberate, mechanical, not the grace of habit, but the weight of ritual. She opened the top drawer and slid aside a stack of old telegrams and photographs. Beneath them lay a slim envelope, brittle and slightly curled at the edges. The name on it was unmistakable: to Margaret from Gerald, March 1917. Poirot took it with a delicacy bordering on reverence. "You see," she said, her voice scarcely more than breath, "I had blamed him for everything, for not saving my sister, for lying to me, for retreating into silence. I thought this letter might alter that, but it was too late." "You feared it would vindicate him," Poirot said softly, "and take from you the right to your anger." She didn't reply. Poirot handed the letter back. "It is not for me to open, madame, but if you do not read it, you will never know whether you mourned the truth, or only your version of it." Lady Margaret stared down at the envelope for a long time. Then she closed her hand around it, as if gathering the strength of 30 silent years. We sat in silence as she returned to her chair, the letter resting now on her lap. At length, with the fire crackling low behind her, she lifted the flap and drew out a single sheet of paper, folded carefully, ink faded, but still legible. Her eyes moved slowly across the page. At first her expression remained unreadable, but as the silence stretched, I saw her face begin to change. First in the tremor of her lip, then the softest frown, and finally a stunned stillness, as if something long frozen within her had begun to thaw. She read it aloud, her voice unsteady. "My dearest Margaret, I do not know if you will ever forgive me, not for my failings, though they were many, but for what I did not say. It was not I who wrote the last letter to your sister. It was Alan. He loved her too, desperately, but when she chose me, he changed. It was his words that drove her to the edge, not mine. I did not realize until too late, until she was gone. And by then, he had vanished. I should have told you. I was a coward, but know this, I have never stopped loving you. G." The paper slipped slightly in her hands. "I blamed him all these years," she said hoarsely. And it was not even his voice in the letter she read. Porro bowed his head. "Some truths," he said gently, "arrive too late, but they are truths nonetheless." That evening, after supper, the drawing-room took on its customary air of strained civility. The fire crackled softly. Decanters were passed with the subdued clink of cut glass. Conversation floated above the undercurrent of shared unease that seemed to have settled over Ellsworth Hall like a veil. Alan Hesketh reclined by the hearth, pipe in hand, offering occasional remarks in his light, pleasant voice. Observations on the sunset, on the turn of the wind across the moor, on the sonnet form as misunderstood by modern verse. Porro, nestled in a high-backed chair, regarded him steadily over his steepled fingers. Though the others smiled politely at Hesketh's cultured musings, I noticed Porro's gaze never wavered. "Strange, is it not, Hastings?" he murmured to me later. "How a man who claims to have served during the most brutal years of war can recall only rhymes and skylarks, and never once mud." I frowned. Perhaps he simply prefers not to speak of it. Porro's eyes glinted. "Ah, mais non. That is not the same thing at all." The next morning found Porro in unusually industrious mood. He wrote a short letter, crisp, folded with military neatness, and instructed me to post it with urgency on our way into the village. "To an old friend in the War Office," he said. "We played a game of chess during the peace talks. He cheats, but remembers faces." "May I ask the purpose?" I ventured. Porro straightened his cuffs. "You may. I have asked him to search the service records of the Royal Artillery, years 1915 to 1919, for a man by the name of Alan Hesketh. If such a man existed, he will find him. And if he doesn't, then we must consider the possibility, mon ami, that our poet invented his past. I glanced out the window toward the grey sky. He seemed a gentle fellow. Odd perhaps, but harmless. Porro's expression was unreadable. Even the most peaceful face may hide a storm. 2 days later the telegram arrived. It was delivered with the morning tray, tucked discreetly beneath the Yorkshire post, as if the postboy himself feared its contents might unsettle the tea. Porro unfolded it with the calm precision of a man unwrapping a fragile artifact. His eyes flicked across the message. A long pause followed. "No Alan Hesketh," he said finally, handing it to me. "Not in the Royal Artillery. Not in the Medical Corps. Not in any branch at all." I stared at the slip of paper. "But look here. Possible match. Thomas Eden, stretcher-bearer, Western Front. Discharged 1918. No known family. Not re-enlisted." Porro nodded slowly. "The height matches. So does the age." I set the telegram down. Why would a man change his name to become someone who doesn't exist? To escape who he once was, Porro said quietly. Or perhaps to find the man he believes he should have been. That afternoon, Porro requested a word with Hesketh, or rather, the man pretending to be him. The two of them withdrew to the library, leaving me, it must be confessed, gnawing with curiosity outside the door. When Porro finally emerged, his expression bore that peculiar combination of triumph and sadness I had come to recognize when a great puzzle began to unravel. He recounted their conversation to me later in low tones, seated beside the fire. "I told him what I knew," Porro began, "that there is no record of an Alan Hesketh, that the man described in the archives, Thomas Eden, was of similar build and age." At first he said nothing. Porro paused, eyes half closed, then he spoke. Slowly he admitted his name, Eden, a stretcher-bearer. He had served under Harriman, yes, Ypres, and again near Parshendale. He described Harriman as charming, yes, but careless, a man who gave orders with a kind smile, and never stood in the mud himself. And why the pretense? Poirot's voice dropped. Because Eden never truly returned from the war. He wanted to become someone new, someone admired, a poet, a guest, not a man of blood and memory. As Porro continued, I found myself leaning forward unconsciously, drawn into the unfolding confession. Eden, he said, had a brother, younger by 2 years. They had enlisted together. He was not clever, but loyal, sweet-natured. They were together during the trench rotations of late 70s. Poirot's gaze darkened. There came a day, a bright frost-glass morning, when Harriman ordered their company forward. A ridge, Eden said, unnecessary, lightly defended, but watched. He begged Harriman to delay, to wait for dusk. Harriman refused. Porro nodded. He insisted on the advance. 3 men were killed within 20 yards. One of them was Eden's brother. The silence between us grew long. He never forgave him, Porro said softly, but he never confronted him either. He changed his name, reinvented himself, and then by chance or fate, found himself here, under the same roof as the man who had sent his brother to die. But he didn't kill him, I asked. Poirot's gaze flicked up. None. Of that I am certain. There is grief in Eden, but not murder. Still, there are truths in this house that fester, and men who carry wounds deeper than the skin. Porro said nothing to the others that evening, not a word of telegrams, or false names, or blood-stained memories. He sat beside the piano while Dora Vale played softly, some wandering nocturne that stirred more than it soothed. Hesketh, Eden, lingered at the edge of the room, glass in hand, the firelight dancing on his face. There was a hollowness about him now, as though the man he had tried to be had fallen away, and the old one had not yet returned. I sat beside Porro and studied his profile in the glow. "You let him stay," I said quietly. "Why?" Porro did not look at me. "There are questions, Hastings, that serve no justice in the asking. He has already paid, in silence, in solitude, in shame. And sometimes," he added, "the truth must wait its moment." I nodded, though I did not entirely understand. But Porro, I saw, understood it all. It was nearly dusk when Porro rose from his chair with an air of quiet decision and requested that I remain behind. He took neither walking stick nor lantern, only his overcoat and gloves, and made for the moor with that peculiar deliberate stride of his, not fast, but without pause. I watched from the long gallery window as his figure diminished into the twilight, then disappeared into the heathered hills. Later, when I questioned him, he said simply, "There are footsteps one must retrace alone, Hastings." He returned near an hour later, his boots lightly dusted and his moustaches unruffled, though I detected a shift in his mood. Something had changed, not as a result of dramatic revelation, but of confirmation. The kind of clarity Poirot seemed always to reach, not by the accumulation of evidence, but by a single whisper of logic falling into place. As he shed his coat, he murmured, "He was not alone that night. That much is now certain. And yet, it is not the presence of another that intrigues me most, but the absence." I frowned. "You mean someone was there, but not when he died?" "Just so," Porro said softly. "That is the delicate thread." What struck Porro most, he later told me, was the silence. The moor, so vast, so open, carried sound like a lake carries ripples. And yet, despite the shepherd's tale of a cry in the wind, then footsteps that halted abruptly, Porro had heard nothing that evening but the soft sigh of heather and the faint whimper of a curlew far off. There was no echo, he said, not even my own. Yet when one listens closely, one hears patterns. You see, Hastings, the wind does not conceal, it reveals. It carries the direction of fear. He had paused at the spot Blakely had described, a curve of earth between the crag and the hollow. There, Porro said, he had stood still and counted 32 seconds of unbroken silence, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. Something happened, he whispered, but not at the time they all believe. Porro crouched near the crag, his fingers brushing the ground as lightly as a pianist seeking the first note. The dew had long since vanished, but he studied the soil, and what remained told its own story. The moss had not been crushed. The earth, dry beneath the overhang, bore no mark of hurried tread. And yet, he said to me, our good Mr. Blakely insists he heard someone walking away. If so, where are the prints? Even a ghost must leave some shadow behind. His conclusion was clear. No one had fled the sea immediately after Harriman's fall. No footprints, no scuffle, no path through the grass, disturbed in haste. Which leaves us, he added, with but one possibility. The killer returned, after the others had gone, after the body had been found, after the world thought the story was over. He stood slowly, eyes narrowed. That, mon ami, is the true crime. He was turning to leave when something caught his eye, a faint gleam among the roots of the gorse bush. He bent, and with a murmur of surprise, lifted it gently from the grass. A glove, delicate, soft leather, ivory cream, the kind a woman might wear on a spring afternoon walk. It lay crumpled, its fingers curled inward as if in pain, and it was clean, remarkably so. Porro frowned. The ground where it lay was mottled with moss and mud, yet the glove bore no smear, no stain. Even the seams beneath the wrist remained unsullied. It has been washed, he said aloud, brushing the inside cuff. Deliberately, not by rain, no, by water, and then returned here, where it would surely be found, or not found, depending on the finder. He turned it over once more, then placed it carefully into his coat pocket. "Ah," he said softly, "but what is more interesting than a glove, Hastings, is what it conceals, or perhaps what it matches." He said no more that night, though I saw him sit for some time by the fire, the glove folded across his knee, like a memory waiting to be acknowledged. The next morning, as Lady Margaret sat on the terrace with her embroidery, Porro joined her with studied casualness. I observed from a distance, pretending to read the Times, but following their exchange through gesture and glance. At one point, Lady Margaret rose and turned, and there, as she adjusted her shawl, it became unmistakable. She wore only one glove. Porro made no comment. He merely inclined his head and said something that made her lips tighten, not in confusion, but in recognition. Her answer was brief, and not audible from where I sat, but her tone was clipped. When Porro returned, I met him at the threshold. "Forgetfulness?" I asked. He shook his head. "No, not forgetfulness. Guilt is an unbalanced thing, Hastings. It makes one glove heavy to wear, the other impossible." He patted his coat gently, and I understood he still carried the one he had found. Porro spent that afternoon alone in the morning room with pen and paper, his little grey cells, as he fondly called them, deeply engaged in the architecture of time. He drew no maps. Porro was not a man of topography. What he charted instead was rhythm, the heartbeat of the evening in question. When Gerald Harriman had last been seen, when the cry had echoed across the moor, when the shepherd had passed the stile, when the body had been discovered, when the watch had stopped, 9:17, he murmured, tapping the page. "But we know now that the watch was planted, stopped to fix a lie in time. Ah, yes, and the glove, it was never lost. It was removed, washed, hidden, and then returned once the storm had passed." I watched him from the doorway, reluctant to interrupt. "What are you doing, old chap?" I asked finally. Porro looked up. "I am restoring order, Hastings, to a crime that relied on confusion. You see, the truth was not hidden in darkness, it was hidden in daylight." She waited, this person, waited for the silence, then she made her move. I blinked. "She?" Porro smiled faintly. "Always it is the detail that reveals the hand." That evening, I found Porro in the library, alone seated before the unlit hearth. He did not speak at once. His hands rested lightly on his knees. The room was still. After a long silence, he exhaled. "It was not rage," he said, almost to himself. "Not even hatred. No, it was something colder, something older." I said nothing. I had learned when not to interrupt him. Porro's eyes drifted toward the window, beyond which the moor lay shrouded in dusk and memory. "It was never an act of passion," he whispered. "It was one of memory." There was in his voice a weight that startled me, as though some unseen sorrow had finally resolved into clarity. He stood then, slowly. "Come, Hastings, tomorrow it ends." And in the quiet that followed, I felt it too. The truth had arrived, and it wore a woman's glove. The drawing-room had never seemed so somber. Outside, the moor lay hushed beneath a sky of pewter grey, as though nature herself were holding her breath. Inside, the household gathered one by one, Lady Margaret first, composed as ever in a wine-dark gown, then Miss Vale, pale and nervously clutching her shawl. Alan Hesketh, or rather Thomas Eden, stood by the hearth, hands clasped behind his back. Even the footman Michael, summoned from his duties, lingered near the doorway with lowered eyes. Porro stood before the fire, his silhouette flickering faintly in the shifting light. There was no drama in his stance, no oratory flourish, only stillness, and the weight of a mind that had reached its conclusion. I sat beside the piano, notebook in hand, though I knew I would write nothing until it was over. Porro's expression bore no triumph, only a grave serenity. He glanced at no one in particular. "My friends," he said softly, "we have come to the end." Porro began as he always did, not with accusation, but with order. He spoke quietly, as though explaining a delicate composition to students of music. "We were told," he said, "that Mr. Harriman died alone on the moor, a fall from the crag, perhaps a quarrel, perhaps a stumble in the dark. But that is not the truth. Let us instead consider what we know." He turned slightly toward me. The wristwatch, found shattered beside the body, was stopped at 9:17. Convenient, yes, too convenient. It suggests a time of death. But what if it suggests something else? A planted clue, a fixed moment to deceive. His eyes moved around the room. Then we have the footprints, or rather the lack of them. The ground was soft in places, but there were no prints beyond those of the shepherd. How can this be? If someone fled. He paused, because no one fled. The killer did not run, they returned. Soda. A murmur swept through the room, but Porro held up a hand. And what did they leave behind? A glove, clean, unsullied. In the mud, he let the question hang. Messieurs, mesdames, the puzzle is complete. There are no missing pieces, only the one we did not wish to see. Porro's gaze shifted, and now it rested on Lady Margaret. "There are two walks to consider," he said, "one that led to the death, and one that followed it." His tone was gentle, but firm. The person who killed Gerald Harriman returned later that night. After the body had been discovered, after the shock had been absorbed, not to confess, not to flee, but to clean. He took a slow breath, to remove the signs of struggle, to reposition the watch, to erase the marks on the ground, and finally, to leave the glove. A symbol, not a slip. A whisper of conscience masked as forgetfulness. Lady Margaret's hands, folded tightly in her lap, did not move. But I noticed a tremor at her throat, the tiniest flutter, like a heartbeat breaking rhythm. Porro inclined his head slightly. "Twice she walked that path, you see, once as judge, and once as mourner." He withdrew the glove from his coat pocket, holding it lightly as though it were some fragile relic of antiquity. Soft leather, ivory in color, of excellent make. One would assume it had been lost, a trifle of haste in a moment of grief, but no. He turned the glove gently. It was washed, cleaned after the act, placed where it might, or might not, be found. A message perhaps, or simply the impulse of one who wished to undo a thing too late. He did not look at her now. He did not need to. Lady Margaret's posture remained rigid, but her complexion had turned the shade of stone. She said nothing, no denial, no defense, only silence. Porro's voice softened. "In all my years I have learned, a glove is not only what it covers, it is what it hides. And in this case, it hid grief." Porro stepped closer to the fire, and for a moment the glove disappeared from view. There was, too, a letter, a soldier's letter, lost during the chaos of war. A single envelope misplaced at the village post office in 1917, and found only recently among Mr. Harriman's belongings. He glanced toward Colonel Lake. "You remembered it, did you not, Colonel?" The young Lady Margaret's distress, the wait for news, and the letter that never came. Porro turned back to the room. The contents were simple but devastating. Gerald Harriman wrote of your sister's death, not as cause but as witness. He had not abandoned her. He had tried to protect her. She had taken her own life, shamed by her circumstances, fearful of disgrace. And he, a soldier abroad, had blamed himself. His voice grew quieter. He wrote to say he loved you still, that he understood your silence, that he would wait. Porro's eyes lingered on Lady Margaret. But that letter never reached you, and in its absence you nursed a wound into hatred. You believed him to be your sister's betrayer, when in truth he was the only one who remained loyal to both of you. Porro's voice, though still calm, took on the subtle weight of sorrow. It is not uncommon, he said, for grief to wear the mask of righteousness. You believed, Lady Margaret, that he had ruined your sister, that he had lied, deceived, and gone on with life untouched. He did not raise his voice. There was no need. You watched him return from war with honors. You watched him build his house, his reputation, and each year the silence of that lost letter grew louder in your heart. Lady Margaret's gaze did not waver, not from Porro, not from herself. She sat as though carved from marble. And so Porro said gently, "You waited until you could wait no longer." The walk to the crag, a final reckoning. Words passed, perhaps, but in the end it was your hand that pushed him, and it was not justice. It was pain, old, terrible pain, but misplaced. He stepped back. "I do not condemn you. The law will speak now, as it must. But I ask you, do you see now, madame, what might have been, had the letter arrived?" A silence fell, and for the first time her eyes dropped. She had no answer. There remained, of course, one final mystery, the footsteps heard by the shepherd Blakely, that curious pattern of sounds in the dark, echoing across the moor in the hour after the death. Porro turned to me, then with a faint apologetic smile. "And now, my dear Hastings, mon pauvre ami, I must confess a small misdirection of my own." He gestured toward the window. "The footsteps heard that night were not those of the murderer returning. They were yours, mine. You walked the same route days later, after the storm. The moor was quiet, sound carried. Blakely, confused by time and wind, misremembered, or rather he remembered too well, but the imprint of guilt made his hearing unreliable. I stared astonished. "You mean I was the ghost?" Porro chuckled softly. "Every crime casts shadows, Hastings. Some are longer than others, and as I looked around the room, at the faces no longer hiding, at the story now complete, I knew the shadows at last had begun to lift. The corridor felt colder than the rest of the house, though no window stood open. Lady Margaret walked between two constables, with the elegance of someone attending an evening recital, not facing arrest. She did not glance at Porro, nor at me, but as she passed the long mullioned window overlooking the moor, she paused for the briefest moment. Her gaze went not to the gravel path below nor to the waiting motor car, but to the pale expanse of Ellsworth Moor beyond, that wind-lashed wilderness which had claimed so many secrets, and finally demanded one truth in return. Then, with a faint nod to something or someone unseen, she resumed her slow march forward. Not a single word escaped her lips, and I, though never prone to sentiment, felt a certain ache settle in my chest, for what had been lost, yes, but more so for what might have been salvaged, had silence not stood in the way. Colonel Lake met us at the base of the stair, his bearing rigid as ever, though the edges had begun to fray. He offered us tea, then rescinded the offer with a wave of the hand, as if ashamed by the banality of the gesture. His jaw worked silently for a moment, and he opened the door for us himself. I suppose he began, then abandoned the sentence altogether. Poirot bowed slightly. You were a loyal friend, Colonel. The old man gave a curt nod, but the eyes that met mine were not those of a soldier. They were the eyes of a man suddenly older, heavier. I sensed his grief was not solely for Margaret, nor even for Gerald. It was for time itself, for the days wasted, the truths buried, the kindnesses withheld when they might have made all the difference. Some wounds, I thought, do not bleed. They echo. We stepped out into the morning, and to my surprise, the moor stretched before us in uncommon clarity. For days it had been a shifting veil of mist and shadow, a theatre of confusion, but now, in the thin sunlight, it seemed smaller, tamer, as though the land, too, had surrendered its illusions. Poirot adjusted his gloves, and did not speak. I turned to look once more at the high path winding toward the crag, where stone met sky. There was no trace of what had occurred, no broken branch, no altered earth, and yet the weight remained, not in the landscape, but in us. The wind stirred faintly through the grasses. I fancied I heard again that faint, fading cry, though I knew now it had never truly been heard at all, only imagined, only mourned, and still, somehow, still believed. We took the small carriage down toward the village station, the wheels ticking steadily like a clock too weary to chime. Poirot stared out of the window for a long while, then, with no change in tone or posture, he spoke. Memory Hastings is a curious tyrant. It tells us what we wish to hear, but also what we cannot endure to forget. I nodded, unsure whether to interrupt. He continued. It colors justice too. The law desires facts. But justice, she desires understanding. And yet, he paused, clasping his hands more tightly. When understanding comes too late, it becomes a cold thing, like a letter never posted, like truth arriving when its recipient no longer has the heart to read. His voice trailed off, and for a while there was only the sound of the countryside passing by. I have seen many crimes, he said at last, but few are born of evil alone. This, he gestured back toward Ellsworth Hall, though we could no longer see it. This was grief, fermented over years. Justice has spoken, but it speaks with a chill. I looked away then. I could not bear to see the sorrow on his face. That night, as I lay awake in the dim light of the village inn, I found myself listening to silence and hearing footsteps. Not real ones, not even remembered ones, imagined, echoed, made monstrous by repetition. They beat a slow rhythm across my mind. Crunch, pause, turn, again and again, the same direction, the same dreadful stillness between each step. They were not the footsteps of a murderer, nor even of me, though I knew I had walked that moor. They were the footsteps of regret, of all that went unsaid between people who once loved, who had every chance to make peace, and chose silence instead. I rose at one point and went to the window. The moor was gone now, tucked behind hedgerows and mist, but in my mind it stretched on forever, a place where every footstep waited to be answered. The train whistled once before, pulling from the station, its carriages shuddering into motion with that familiar English reluctance, as though even the rails wished to delay departure from such a place. Porro sat across from me in the narrow compartment, his valise neatly at his feet. He had spoken little that morning, and not at all during breakfast. Now, with a delicacy reserved for sacred things, he withdrew his leather-bound notebook, the one he had used since our arrival at Ellsworth Hall. I saw the final page, a short column of underlined facts, a date and 3 lines in French. He read it once more then, without flourish, closed the cover and fastened the clasp. His eyes did not meet mine. Sometimes he murmured, more to the window than to me, the past should not be solved, only understood. I leaned back slowly, feeling the words settle between us like dust. The countryside flew by, fields rising and dipping, sheep clustered on distant hills, a stone wall crumbling under ivy. England eternal, and yet always forgetting. And I, Hastings, with my tidy moustache and untidy conscience, knew I would carry this case longer than most, not because of its mystery, but because it had none. Some truths arrived too late to save the living, and too heavy to bury with the dead. On the moor where silence once masked a scream, the past has spoken at last, but not without cost. Justice may have stirred, but did it bring peace, or only the cold clarity of consequence? Would you have forgiven what could never be explained? If this mystery moved you, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that linger long after the final word.